Next level. Next level.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is the Aspen City Council continuation of June 28th, 2022 meeting. That'll be a call to order. Could we have a roll call for attendance, please?
Here.
Councilor Allenstein. Present. Councilor
Mesro. Present.
Councilor Richards.
Here.
Mayor Tory.
I'm here. All right. Well, we are reconvening on a Thursday at 2 o'clock to continue the public hearings for ordinance 13 and 14. And we had a couple outstanding issues that we wanted to have more information about and address as well at staff level. So they are back to report on what they've come up with, and we'll go from there. Philip, do you want to introduce?
Please, and thank you, Mayor Tory and Council. For the record, I'm Philip Supino, Community Development Director with the city. I'm joined to my right by Jessica Garrow with Design Workshop, and online by David Betcher with RRC and Associates. To my left is Ben Anderson, Long Range Planner, and Garrett Larimer, Senior Planner. This is a continuation of a second reading of ordinances 13 and 14 from Tuesday, 6/28. And I'll just make a procedural note. Jessica had a standing conflict, and she has to leave us at 3:30. So again, we're here to continue discussion about ordinances 13 and 14. Staff took feedback from council at the 6/28 meeting. And we've been busy for the last 39 hours preparing responses to council direction. At that time, a majority of council favored further analysis of opportunities to sort of address the issue related to full-time local residents and the demolition allotment system. We've worked with legal to prepare responses to that direction from council, and our plan this afternoon is to review elements of the current ordinance, discuss a possible amendment to that ordinance, as well as staff's recommendation as it relates to the current language and potentially revised language. Prior to getting into the ordinance itself, staff has prepared some responses to council discussion as well as public comment from second reading. These are comments that would have been made in the course of council discussion and dialogue with staff on Tuesday. But again, because of the continuation, I'd like to begin with some of those remarks today. I just want to remind council, first of all, the way that staff engaged in the moratorium project broadly. We heard from hundreds of respondents throughout our community, different economic sectors, different social classes, economic classes. And the comments that we felt like we heard on Tuesday represent a narrow sampling of the broad community sentiment that we heard as part of our outreach efforts. That narrow sampling was related to affected parties. And we just want to put some of that into the broader context, again, of the feedback that we heard, particularly with respect to some of the larger policy objectives that council sought to address through this moratorium process. A majority of process participants supported an equal playing field for owners, applicants, anybody who's participating, be it in the demolition allotment system or in a paying of affordable housing mitigation or the short-term rental market for that matter. And that they really favored that equal playing field for folks who were forced to participate in one way or another in these revised regulations. And we also heard specific feedback that creating special paths for specific groups would be contrary to that sort of equal playing field that folks, be they in the development community, property owners, or non-owner residents, sought as an outcome of this process. With respect to the effect of the new rules on individuals, the public comment on Tuesday seemed to suggest a perception that the demolition allotment procedures, as they're currently written, would prevent an individual from using their property as they see fit. Staff does not believe this is the case. The proposed ordinance increases procedural and financial obligations for property owners seeking to redevelop. That is abundantly clear, and we've been as transparent as is possible about that. And those financial and procedural obligations, which are elevated, are in a direct response to the environmental and affordable housing objectives which council directed staff to address through this process. And so in that way, we feel like it's proportional and reasonable and necessary given the policy objectives. Applying for an allotment does come with some time uncertainty, right? I mean, that's sort of baked into this heightened procedural element. But we believe that the multi-year allotment structure, as currently written, addresses some of those time constraints, as expressed in public comment on Tuesday. And then on the allotment process specifically, there were suggestions that the proposed allotment system, that process would somehow be unmanageable, somehow be unpredictable. The city staff manages myriad complex, highly consequential processes as they relate to development every day. And we are perfectly capable of dealing with those consequences, dealing with that complexity, and doing so in a way that ensures an equitable, predictable, and effective process, no matter what we're talking about, whether it's something that we already do in the course of business or something new, like the allotment system in these ordinances. And then with respect to some of the comments made about city staff, there was a suggestion that city staff are hungover rubes who are somehow incapable of executing our duties. This has no relationship whatsoever to the reality of the customer experience that our customers have with ComDev staff every day. And I also think this is demonstrated by the hours staff spent with Mr. Maple explaining these complex issues, engaging in dialogue, and listening and responding over the course of many months. Whatever Mr. Maple's sort of pre-existing feelings are about his government and about the dedicated people that serve him as public servants, they don't reflect the level of service we feel like is provided to our customers every day, and that we have provided to him consistently over decades, and certainly in the last few months during this process. The fact that we're here today, having listened and responded, is a testament to our capabilities and our professionalism, and I would like that on the record. And finally, and I think most importantly, there's been consistent suggestions that somehow these regulations are not, wouldn't be effective in responding to council and the community's environmental concerns, and that they wouldn't be sufficient to address climate and take meaningful climate action. The community overwhelmingly supported climate action and and mitigating landfill-related impacts through these regulations. Addressing these issues through better development regulations, which is what these ordinances would do, was the basis of a huge portion of this process. And industry-leading professionals have led us to this point with this framework. And we believe that the proposed regulations are the most surgical means that staff could deploy to address climate and environmental and landfill concerns from development without fundamentally changing the development industry in our community. And so in that way, we're proud of, again, the proportionality and the sort of reasonableness of this response. So that's staff's response to public comment and some of the dialogue that was conducted on Tuesday. I forgot to share my screen, and I apologize for that. With your permission, I'd like to start sharing your presentation. Thank you. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ben, who's going to walk us through a little bit more ordinance detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip.
For the record, Ben Anderson, planner with community development. Based on the conversation that we heard towards the end of our long evening on Tuesday, we certainly heard the public comments, and they reflected comments that we've heard in one way or another kind of throughout our process. And I think it's that council at different points in the process did give very clear direction to us to contemplate the impacts that any of our regulation would have on the locals, and making sure that we weren't somehow creating a circumstance that would be difficult for those folks, or make staying here more difficult for those folks. And throughout our process, as we started to hone in on the ideas that we came up with, certainly this demolition allotment became a focus of our discussion. And, as the structure of that program played out, and we had conversations and focus groups, we do think that the program as described in the current ordinance as written took into account some of the things that we heard, and I'll get into that in just a second. But based on the conversation that we heard the other evening, we think that there's two options that council could consider on this topic. The first is to utilize the system as it's currently proposed, with the existing off-ramps that we think are important and have been in the land use code for a long time. The multi-year allotment process is there. There's an appeal process in GMQS. Both would be paths for folks who couldn't get a development allotment of a particular year's demolition allotments. However, and so it's staff's recommendation to keep the ordinance as it is. But listening to the comments from council members towards the end of the evening on Tuesday, we have spent the last day or so trying to think about a way to respond to that and provide an alternative. And so the alternative that we are proposing is to create a new multi-year allotment path that has minimal review criteria for resident locals. And we see this as a direct response to the comments that we heard, and both from the citizens who made comments the other evening, and also council direction at the end of the meeting. So option one, I do want to give a little bit of a defense to where we landed on what is proposed and in the ordinance currently. These are long-established code processes that are related to all development allotments, multi-year allotment and appeal process. We talked about both of those. The distinction between those is that the multi-year allotment, if you go after that, there is a set of fairly rigorous expectations that you're doing a project that goes above and beyond, whether that's contributing additional affordable housing mitigation or contributing to transit goals or something else with your development project. In the appeal process, there's not that same condition, but the review criteria for council, if someone were to appeal to you because they couldn't get an allotment, there's not a lot of definition of that. It's there, it's been there for a long time, but there's not a lot of review criteria associated with it, and it would be, I think, difficult both for people applying to you and also for you to evaluate whether or not you should be granting someone an exception to the number of allotments that are available year to year. We do feel that as our program evolved with the demolition allotments, that we did create an application process that requires very minimal and objective application requirements. We heard a lot about that in the comments on Tuesday night about sort of the difficulty of the process. And again, there was a moment in time where we were proposing a competition system and a P&Z review, and specifically in response to the concerns that local applicants would be at a disadvantage against speculative developers or folks that had more resources in the development process. We made an effort to make that application process as streamlined and straightforward with a very basic set of submission requirements at the time to get the demolition allotment. We also worked with council direction to make a very predictable and standardized application process where the importance of that completeness review was really built into our process. But this is where I think where staff struggles on this topic that was raised on Tuesday night, partially because of the comments that Philip made where, you know, we want to treat all applicants the same. But I do think that there's a real inherent difficulty with determining localness and what that means and how to evaluate that with all the kind of complex relationships that are out there with how families have owned properties and how they transfer from one generation to the next. That's a difficult thing to evaluate. And so I think that's primarily staff's concern with going off in a different direction or proposing an alternative is simply that criteria of localness is difficult to arrive at. Not impossible, but a difficult thing that I think people have different understandings of definition of that. And then lastly, we think that the way things are structured in the current code proposal is that we think that this number of demolition and redevelopment projects is an important threshold, and we think that the current code kind of maintains the integrity of that. So this is kind of a short list of the things why staff is recommending to keep the code as it is. However, we heard very clearly, again, both the comments from the public Tuesday night and also council's response to that. So option one is code as is. Option two is a new council review. In GMQS, there's a whole series of things that council evaluates within the GMQS system. One of those things is the multi-year allotment process. Because of the additional requirements of multi-year, we think that if council were to want to go in this direction and create a special path that did not put additional burden on a local applicant, that this would be a path where we use that multi-year allotment, but for this group of people that can prove that they or an immediate family member has owned or occupied the home in question for more than 35 years, that they would be subject to a council review. If they came in for an allotment through our administrative process, there was an allotment available to them, they could go immediately into this path. And that the review criteria would be very minimal, would not require them to show additional performance for their project beyond what they are already proposing. The process would be minimal. It would be a resolution. There would be no public hearing associated with it. It would be a decision that council would make during your action items in a consent or in an agenda. And as proposed, the allotment would reduce the allotments for a coming year, much like the multi-year allotment system. It's simply that the criteria for a person who could show evidence of being a resident local would be subject to a different set of criteria and a much much more reduced set of criteria.
Just a clarifying question. I'm
Yes.
pretty sure you just said this, but I want to make sure I understand. This creates a new pathway for essentially a local to have a fast pass to sort of jump the line if they meet these requirements. It does not and would not result, if we're looking down at a 10-year window, in an additional or any additional demolitions over time.
As proposed by staff at this moment, that's the case.
Okay, and then the second question is, I see the 35 years previous ownership, but there is no requirement here for what happens thereafter. You could come in and do this and then sell the property tomorrow?
Yes, and that's critically important. We spent some time thinking about post-allotment issuance governors, and we don't believe that we can really put anything in place from a legal standpoint that would prevent somebody from getting an allotment, getting a development order even with an allotment and selling the property, or getting an allotment, redeveloping, and then immediately selling the property. And just to hit it right on the nose, I mean, I think that some of those scenarios may be the precise objective of property owners. And I'm not making a judgment about that. I just want to be transparent that it's our belief that that's a scenario that would be favorable to some people.
Yeah, and can be argued not in the best interest of the overall community.
Thank you. I was going to ask a question. It kind of relates to what we've heard before and where we are now. But I had been thinking about it, as we all have, over the last 24 hours. And it seems that it's been kind of current practice, or happens a lot, that people will put a property under contract contingent upon getting approvals for whatever they're designing at planning and zoning and things like this. And that if they don't get their approval, whether it's HPC or P&Z, the contract's null and void. And so a lot of those potential buyers are already spending significant dollars with designers, with architects, coming in to say they're meeting the code and the setbacks and the height and any other set of requirements as they try to pursue their entitlements. And that's kind of very common in practice. And what we were hearing before is that no one will buy the house and put the money into, or sign a contract, put money into designing to go through the process unless they are sure they're going to get this permit. But yet people go through our processes all the time without the surety that they're going to be granted the planning and zoning approval or the HPC approval for the design that they like. And so it just struck me that this is, that's kind of common, that a contingency contract will be offered, whether or not they know with surety that they're going to get the approvals they need through our current processes.
I think that's a possible scenario for sure. And we heard some feedback prior to second reading about the idea that these demolition allotments could increase speculation in residential real estate. I think staff's response to that is possibly, and people sell properties with entitlements all the time, with architectural, with approved architectural plans all the time. So there's, we don't believe that these dynamics would represent a major departure from real estate dynamics as they exist today.
Thank you.
Ward?
Yeah, kind of tied in with what Rachel was saying. We heard a number of comments about locals not having, or putting hundreds of thousands of dollars into plans in order to apply and get a demolition permit. Could you run us through exactly what's required to receive a demolition permit?
For the record, Garrett Larimer, planner with the City of Aspen. We've, as part of the demolition allotment review, based on feedback from the design community and from a lot of the public outreach that we did, we simplified the application contents as much as possible. So we're really requesting the standard application contents that are required for any type of land use review in the land use code. There's like a land use application packet, there's proof of ownership of the property, there would be an authorization to represent if you had a representative authorized to represent the ownership's interests, contact information, project information, and a survey. And those requirements are standard for every application type. And so the process would require, we're going to produce a boilerplate pre-app for these projects. With the application contents listed in that pre-app, they're also listed in a section of the growth management system. So those are widely available and publicly available now. And that application would need to be submitted. Staff would review those on a first come, first served basis based on the timestamp that the email is delivered. And if all of those kind of administrative documents are included, the application would be deemed complete. It does not require a fully developed architectural plan. It does not require a fully developed engineered site. It is very administrative, and the intention behind that is to allow for that certainty that we heard was necessary in this process before people invested significant money in a fully developed design. So we've really pared down the application contents in response to that feedback.
Okay, so just so it's abundantly clear to me and to the public that in order to get a demolition permit, you do not have to have 100% schematic or construction drawings, or all you have to have is those surveys, proof of ownership, and you don't have to say exactly what you're going to do with the property once you've got the demolition.
Yeah, I would just.
I want to really quickly clarify one thing. It's the application for the demolition allotment. If you're applying for an actual demolition permit through the building department, you'll meet all of the requirements, showing that you're mitigating for asbestos and things like that. That is not what is being proposed as part of this land use code amendment. It is exactly as Garrett described, regular land use application requirements, a survey, proof of ownership, a vicinity map, responding to any of the review criteria that are applicable. That's how you apply for this demolition allotment.
So the allotment just allows you to proceed to get the permit.
Correct.
And what happens if somebody has an allotment, but then they have a 3-year period or to produce the rest of that information?
That's correct.
Yeah, and just to tag on, if it's okay. And so the elements that we're looking at that would require more of the climate change mitigation or issues regarding the efficiency of the house would come at the later stage after someone has their allotment and they want to proceed to the demo permit for the purpose of either the remodel or reconstruction of the new home.
Correct. That's correct.
Thank you.
At the risk of being pedantic, I heard the sort of bullet point list of things, right? So survey, proof of ownership, et cetera. But in that project info bucket, is it sufficient to just say, I will be redeveloping a home? You don't need to have any specifics about what that will look like at that point? And if so, what are those specifics?
Yeah, I think we have asked for kind of a conceptual site plan, just so that we understand and know kind of the scope of your project and the rough scope of what you're thinking about in terms of the new home. Mm-hmm. And also kind of a set of written responses, not drawings, not architectural sets, but simply a kind of a narrative about the nature of your project and your kind of understanding and awareness of what is going to be required from you at the eventual submission of a building permit, the building and demo permit. Okay. And so it really does push a lot of the detail off to the building permit process, but we want people at that time to be sort of show awareness and some responsiveness at the time that they understand what they're getting into.
And with the recognition that every project is different, a conceptual site plan, what type of workload would that represent?
Fairly minimal. Yeah, I mean, it could be a one-page drawing.
We like to use the term a box in a box for the type of drawing that this would represent, right? I mean, you have a box, which is your lot line, and a box or a series of boxes, which could be the footprint of the home in question, and maybe some natural features, like if you're located on a river corridor or a ditch or something like that. That would
there's no need that this will take 100 hours of work.
This does not require an architect to produce.
Okay. That's helpful.
And again, with the risk of maybe repeating ourselves, the specific language in the ordinance that is in front of you today says that the following performance elements need to be completed prior to building permit issuance. So it is really tied to that permit issuance. It's about what is happening to the new home, the new development that is happening after demolition. So the code language, we feel, and we'll say staff and design workshop have gone back and forth a number of times on this particular topic. And we believe it's very clear that this is related to the permit when you're actually doing the demolition work and the redevelopment work.
That's super, super helpful. Thank you.
So to be perfectly clear, this is a hypothetical based on my real-world situation. My house was built in 1976. We've been living in it since 1982. For me to get an allotment, all I need is a survey and the documents that you indicated. Once I had that allotment, then I have a 3-year vesting. So if my intention is to cash out, not to scrape, build a new house and continue to live in it, if my intention is to cash out, I've got 3 years that is added value to my house because I have an allotment. So 3 years for somebody to put all the money into the diagrams, put all the money into what's needed for the demolition permit and the building permit. So there is added value just by getting the allotment without a huge investment.
That's correct, and that's also where the language is today. It would be obviously incorporated into this option 2, but you do not need to amend the ordinance for the scenario that you described to be true.
To be clear, so under option 1, his scenario works.
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay. That's clear for me.
And since we're trying to understand option 1 versus option 2, the difference is, under option 1, if Ward were to submit his application for a development allotment and be 7th in line, he would then request from council a multi-year development allotment based on the criteria described in the ordinance as it's written now. Under scenario 2, he would be, the path would be slightly different because there would be criteria about his localness, which is the term we just developed downstairs.
I believe it.
In order to seek that 7th allotment at the expense of next year's allotment pool.
You could jump the line.
And just to give a sense, this is the specific code language that would be included if council were to support option 2. And so essentially the 3 review criteria here, again, the review criteria currently for multi-year allotments requires additional performance to be granted a multi-year allotment. In this case, the granting of the multi-year allotment is showing proof of individual or family ownership over the last 35 years and occupancy. Granting of the allotment from a future year is consistent with the Aspen Area Community Plan. And in spite of getting this allotment and in spite of having a slightly different path, they would still be responsible for all the other review criteria that we have for these demolition projects in general. So those are the 3 criteria, much shorter, more compact, and reduced set of criteria than what's present under the current multi-year allotment path.
Rachel?
You know, I appreciate the work coming up with a couple of options for us. I appreciate that. And I'm not sure myself which to go with or anything. So I look forward to the dialogue we're going to have here at the table. Again, given the ability to have contingency contracts, the ability to receive your allotment and still take 3 years to actually exercise that moving forward, or the potential buyer exercising that through the design work they would like to do, I can see where both paths could work. The one thing I have thought is that at the very least, I would consider upping the annual allotment number to 8 instead of 6, and maybe avoid having to go multi-year and these sort of processes just by having a little more availability. It'd be 25% more. I do realize the broader issue, and that's why I don't believe in opening this up to any sort of unlimited or automatic type of session. But, the things that I've thought about in the past 24 hours are very much history, really. Literally, when I was in my re-election race for mayor with Mayor Clanderud, there was a debate, and she made a really striking comment of, can't we have just one summer where there's not all the backup beepers and construction and nails and hammering around us? She's going to control the growth. And it really struck the heart of our community. And I recall very much J.E. DeVilbiss wanting to do something to slow down this pace of demolition and construction around everybody's house, that we're making their houses kind of unlivable. And if you're in that sort of older neighborhood, you're very likely to have one project after another immediately on your doorstep that lasts years to complete. So I think that this is something that people have been trying to get a grip on for a long time. And I think that, as you guys have talked about, it is proportional, it is rational, it is predictive, and it is equitable. The other components I've really been thinking about are literally the Castle Creek Bridge, and the number of dump trucks and dump truck loads, and how much redevelopment and demolition can you have in one season, or 2 seasons, every season, again and again and again, with inadequate infrastructure. And we know there's only X amount of useful life left in that Castle Creek Bridge. How long do we, how can we keep nursing it along? Or how much would this impact and shorten that remaining useful life? When you think about, is it 15 demos in 1 year? Is it 20? And is it an unlimited kind of Wild West market? I don't think is doing our community any good. Again, I'll just leave it at that with my board. I can support either direction. I do tend to believe that the original ordinance is sufficient and can be administered fairly. I would make a modification to increase the annual allotments to 8 and leave, of course, the multi-year process in place. Thank you.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? So you mentioned, when we're looking at option 1, sort of the messiness of identifying localness. Related to, but separate from this, in terms of the deferral agreement, we had talked about looking at the STR standard that we adopted as opposed to the APCHA standard. And I wondered if you guys had looked at it and if you had thoughts and if that was the messiness you were talking about or not.
We can certainly address that, Councilor Mesereau. I think that if we could, just so we're not confusing issues.
Yeah, we can wait.
We can certainly come back to that topic, and we certainly have had conversations about that.
I just heard Rachel giving broader comments, so I was making sure I could tie it together before commenting on one thing without thinking how it connects to the other.
It would be appreciated from staff's perspective if we could move from one topic to the next before moving on.
So do you want comments on this then?
Yeah.
On this,
Okay. Sure. I favor option 1 here. From the public, what I heard was concern from locals around sort of these 2 different areas. One was, how can I fairly compete with a sort of locked, loaded, and armed professional? That's the one that gives me the biggest pause, because we don't want to create an unfair playing field for the people that we're most trying to serve. And I think with the clear specifics of how the process will run, I don't believe that to be the case here. And so that feels sufficiently solved for me. The next thing that was raised is the uncertainty piece, right? Okay, well, I'm competing in a fair process, but I just don't know when I'll be able to get this thing. And that does speak to the time, not in all cases, right? And sometimes you do want to scrape and replace that thing and still live there. And I hear that. The trade-off, of course, from a community standpoint is we get less development, less environmental impact, less overall impact over time on housing, et cetera. I'm comfortable living with that on those edge cases because I have to think about the broader community. But then the last is like that speculative piece, right? I want to cash out and leave. And I get it, and that may be a real impact, but we're here, as Mayor Sterling said, because since the 80s, we've been on that slow and increasing trajectory from community and to commodity. We've watched neighborhoods go dark and become vacant. We've watched them turn into hotels. We've mostly just watched them become less community. We want more community, not less. And so the value to the broad community is having that individual stay in their home, stay in this community. And if they're not going to make that choice, to sell to someone who is going to develop affordable housing as a fourplex, perhaps, or to another local who's going to live there. That's the benefit to the community. I don't see any reason why we should be rewarding or incentivizing the exact outcome we have been saying we don't want for the last 40 years. So I'm comfortable with number one. I appreciate the suggestion on the give. We'll talk about it more in the next one. I agree that there's room for some give to this community or this specific group of our community. I think there's another method I would prefer, but we can talk about it, that for all the reasons you said doesn't add 25% to the landfill and the rest of it. But we'll talk about that after.
John?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. Rachel brought up the number of allotments, and as I recall, that was a number we arrived at after some deliberation. I remember there were some years where we didn't even hit 6 demolitions a year. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And there were only a few where it was over 10.
We've just had one year, the last year, that's been over 10.
Exactly, because of, we could probably chalk that up to COVID and urban exodus and all that stuff. Okay, I throw my support behind option one. It seems clear to me that it is a level playing field. There are multiple avenues to success, and I think we should stay at 6.
If I could just to go back and forth a little bit, I don't have the old memo in front of me, but it seemed to me that staff recommended that we pick something that was between, I can't remember if it was 6 and 8 or 6 and 10, and gave the range and gave the whys. And, you know, I know we all incline towards the lower number, but I can see where for smoother operations, for not having immediate appeals to go to the multi-year, to not have a future council say, oh, well, we need to make the multi-year 12 now because look at the problems we've had. You know, I guess I would rather see a little more flexibility. And, you know, I think that whether it's this or any number of our codes, you know, in thinking about it more, I just thought a little more flexibility helps. And that's all. I don't see it as going from 6 to 16 or 6 to 25, you know, but I see a small allotment difference. And I also had thought, as I mentioned the other night, although it was late, that if we, you know, created a small pool that was just for the over 40-year owners and left the 6 here. But if we're going to leave it all as one, I just would like to increase the pool a little bit. So that's all.
Understood.
Board?
Yeah, I think the fact that we're here this afternoon is, it should be an indication that we have listened to the community responses, and that, for me, that I've given serious consideration to longtime locals in the value that a demolition allotment might have. On the one hand, earlier on Tuesday, we heard comments about how people working for the city and getting 505 fund housing creates a special group of people. And then later on, a couple hours later, we're being asked by longtime locals to create a special group of people for those that have lived in the community. So there's an irony and a conflict in values here. So by creating a special group, of people that have lived in their house for 35 years. I can see value to that, but it also does exactly what was objected to earlier in the meeting. As far as just a point of clarification, you have 3 years in your allotment to get a building permit, then you have another 3 years vested in your building permit to start, and once you start, if you just continue working on it. So you get an allotment now, it could be 10 years before the house is finished. And then anything that we decide here, we don't lock a future council into it. One of the things that we've been saying as we're going through this process is that we're trying to design something that is going to mitigate what we have identified as stresses on our community. We felt that I visualize it as two approaches. One was to decrease the size of the homes, and the other would be to decrease the amount of development. And by using a demolition allotment, it slows the growth without changing the floor area and how big a home could be built. So the speculation for monster homes is still there, which I find objectionable, but we have really good building codes for energy efficiency, and we have an update for that coming by the end of this year. And we are recognized throughout the country, if not the world, as having really aggressive energy efficiency building codes, something that we should be proud of. I'm proud of. And as witnessed by a couple of the seminars that John and I went to, and I think Rachel as well, that we are held up by the state of Colorado as being the gold standard and what everybody else is looking to, and they are interested in what our climate action plan is and what our EV charging master plan is and what our EV master plan is. They want to catch up. Somebody said, well, we want to do better in Aspen, and the presenter said, well, you can't. So what I'm trying to say in this connection is that we're not locking a future council in. We want to have the flexibility to make adjustments if we find that 6 is too many or 6 is not enough. If what we're doing now is creating a unintended consequence, then we have the flexibility and the power to change it, so that we're not making something that's cast in stone, or it's not a gray stone with an epitaph. It's an eraser board. We can come back and we can change things. So our goal, I think, was to slow the pace of residential development and to decrease the impacts on the community. And I think this does it. I think that if we do have a special review for City Council for perhaps a multi-year allotment, I think that there should be at least the ability of the owner of the property to address City Council and make their story. But as I've said about a number of different things, but particularly HPC projects that I've seen come before us, is we get a long story. And then as soon as people get what they want, they flip it. So the story, we have to go by what the application is, and not what the story that's being told to us is, because people will say anything so that they can flip it and get more money out of their, and that's, I've witnessed that for 5 years. And I continually want to I want to listen to the story, but I don't want to be influenced by the story to a point that I'm going to go against what the application or what the guidelines are. I don't want to make a variance or an exception for some story, because more often than not, the story I've heard is creative writing. Yeah, I could go, I think, as it is now, option 1 is that everybody's in the same boat, and that there's a review process to council if you want to get a multi-year allotment.
Ahead of time.
That's correct.
Okay. And there's no special class of people that I would be a member of that gets a demolition permit by right.
That's correct.
Okay? I don't visualize myself wanting to be in a special class of privileged people, so I'm going to support option 1.
John?
Yeah, I just wanted to add really quick that what Ward brought up is this resolution that we are going to be voting on shortly does affect Ward and members of my family. So I think it's important to be impartial.
Yeah, it's actually, I'm glad you said that, because it really stood out to me at the last meeting when Ward mentioned, hey, I am one of these people, and it gave me a lot of solace in our perspective of community first, in the way that I hope, my employment in the short-term rental industry did so on SDR regulations, right? Like, we're really willing to put community first, and Ward understands intimately the situation because he's living it.
Thanks, Sue. Do you have more presentation on this?
We're here, frankly, at this point to support council discussion on the topic. We don't have additional material to respond to anything we've heard to at this point. If there's more discussion needed on anything council would like, we can respond to that. But at this point, based on my hearing of the comments, we're in a good place on this particular topic. I know Councilmember Mesereau mentioned something else that he wanted to discuss, and so unless there's more council discussion on this, I feel like we can move on.
Great. So I want to stay on this for a minute. My comments here are that I appreciate option 2. I think it does have that additional protections for the locals that we are seeking to assist in their planning. So for me, I'm glad that staff has put their effort and energy into this. I appreciate you bringing this back. I appreciate everybody getting together for an extended meeting today. And I still support option 2. That being said, I'm okay with the majority of council here. I recognize that these, as Ward was saying, are codes that are going to be able to be written. We're going to learn a lot from the implementation of these, and they will be able to be adjusted. But I still, I came back to this meeting today because of this specific issue. And so I do appreciate the work that's been put into option 2, and I still support it. When we come to the greater conversation around demolition, again, these are things that are going to move forward as we learn about this process. So another idea, as Rachel brought up, raising the allotments to 8. Another thing that I wanted to throw out to staff for future consideration as we start, thinking about refining anything that's going on now, is 2 tranches. There's nothing that says that annual allotments have to be done January 1. We could have a January and a July submission for demolition. So that's just another opportunity that I want you to just make note of for future discussions, because I know that there will be future discussions.
Tori, can I ask a question?
Sure.
I hear your support for option 2 and respect that. Is it sufficient for you to give voice to that position, knowing that things can be changed in the future and still come to support the overall legislation with us? Or is that
I'll support the overall legislation.
Okay.
The most important thing here is that we are doing something. We are moving in the direction that we've heard our community want to move in. I never thought that in a compressed timeline under a moratorium that we were going to come up with anything that was perfect, but we are moving in the right direction. And like I said, we are going to learn so much as we start to implement and see how this really impacts our community. So I'm excited that we're taking steps forward, and I've got more to say about that in a little bit. Rachel?
Yeah, I just have a question for Ben and Philip and then a comment. But when you first presented the demolition permit element and aspect of this, and I fully agree with the outreach that's been done and the determination that this is the right end of the process to start dealing with these issues, but you had presented us with a number of, we've seen this and we've seen that, and council pick. Would have been upsetting to the entire scheme if council had picked the number 8 demo permits instead of 6?
No, staff presented a range because staff felt that the numbers in that range were all reasonable and proportional relative to the stated policy objectives of the process.
Okay. Thank you. So I just really wanted to make that one point because Tory and Ward and others appropriately say this can be changed, this will grow, this is a living document. But at the same time, change is made because there's been pain involved. There's been people who we felt were shorted, or something, or a future council felt people were shorted. There, change doesn't occur just because, everything was really happy, but let's change it anyhow. And I would just like to give us a little more breathing room. That's really all I'm saying. If we're not going to go with an option 2, and I'd appreciate Tory saying he'll support going forward, even if it's kept to option 1, but I think we could modify this even just a little to ease it in a little more, folks. This is a pretty radical system change, and I just don't see the magic difference of saying it's got to be 6 no matter what, if 8 gives us a little more breathing room for our community, a little more surety, and are not immediately going into hearings on multiple year allotments as soon as this is gone forward. I really, that's my bigger belief. I don't want to have to make changes because there's been real damage, pain, and hurt. And those are the types of things that push change. Thank you.
Can I ask a question of Rachel
Sure.
about that? Is that okay, Tori?
Yep, go right ahead.
I just want to understand, is the idea of adding a bit of like relief in that pressure valve intended to offer that sense of relief or a little bit more room of opportunity for sort of the archetype of the local who's kind of come in and talked to us, or is it intended for a broader audience? How do you think about that?
I just think about when you slice a pie and you're trying to serve a larger party and you serve it with just 6 slices versus 8 slices, maybe you've been able to satisfy more of the people at the party.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I'm not saying who should get a slice and who shouldn't.
Yeah, but they feel there's more pie.
There's more pie.
Okay, I understand that.
Board comments?
Yeah, through a special review for additional allotments on the multi-year, and option 2 actually adds additional allotments for that current year. And it doesn't have any cap. You could have 8 more.
Yeah, under option 2 as proposed, we're
They would come out of
we're
the 6.
continuing to stay with the yearly allotment of 6.
Okay.
But this would grant opportunity in next year or subsequent years to pull an allotment meeting this set of review criteria so that a person who qualified under these review criteria could be subject to a different set of review criteria than others who might be pursuing the multi-year allotment. Because again, one of the big differences between this and the current code is that under current code, there are, a series of standards by which you have to show additional performance on your project above kind of the norm. And so there is, and I do think, as we've, talked with some of the folks who have raised this concern, is that if they are forced in a position where they have to go into a multi-year allotment request, that they're now competing with speculative developers who have many more resources available to them in designing and developing a replacement home.
So I'm a little bit confused because Garrett told us about the streamline application.
Yeah.
So to meet special reviews is dependent upon what that subsequent property is going to be.
Again, the process that Garrett described is going after one of the initial 6. If you were to go into the review for a multi-year allotment, you're then subject to committing to additional performance for your project. And that could be additional affordable housing mitigation. That could be giving space to showing additional benefit to the community to be granted an additional allotment out of the subsequent year.
And Rachel, you're suggesting that we just change across the board to 8 per year,
8 annual.
8 annual.
So if I can step in for just a moment, because what I hear are, I think, 2 different policy objectives being discussed with 2 different solutions. And I want to make sure that we're very clear about the effect of each of those. So option 2 or option 1 is a response to public feedback on Tuesday about the impact of these regulations on a longtime local's ability to redevelop their property. Staff has developed these responses, options 1 and 2, to try and address that and create a separate path for those folks that increases predictability and availability of allotments year on year. But it would not change, under the current proposal, the amount of demolition per year which is permitted in the community. Increasing the number from 6 to whatever, or decreasing the number from 6 to whatever, would affect the amount of demolition going on in the community on an annual basis, not necessarily by whom, right? And so if you're concerned about the climate and landfill policies being the primary objective, then we encourage you to be thoughtful about that number relative to those objectives. Staff does not believe that changing the number would increase the predictability for a long-time local to be able to secure an allotment. It would only change the amount of demolition. And again, staff does not have a position on that one way or another. We presented a range, and we continue to think that that range is reasonable and appropriate. But those are the two different policy areas that we're talking about right now, and I wanted to make sure that was clear.
Real quickly. When we talked about some of the numbers in the past, last year, 14 or 13, so some people argue about demolitions. Previous to that, it was 5 for several years. The demolition permits, the 14 demolition permits that were pulled last year, or are those allotments or permits?
Could you say that again, please?
The 14 of last year, were those allotments or permits?
They were, so just to be clear, we don't do standalone demolition permits.
Yep.
Typically. They come in as part of a building permit.
Okay.
And so you're coming in, and so those were permits issued in 2021. Some of those permits that have issued, the homes have actually come down.
I'm wondering about how many.
How many? The number was 15 between single family and duplex. One of those properties was a unit in the Smuggler Park.
Right.
So it's really, and wouldn't require a demolition allotment,
Yep.
but got a permit for it last year. So I would say fairly it's 14. So you can see on 2021, combined single-family duplex is 15, and I think one of those properties, as we looked at addresses and kind of tried to go down on that list, one of those was a property that would not require a demolition allotment under current code.
Do you have any idea of those permits from last year, how many have been demolished to this point? And here's why I bring this up, is that this is not a brand-new conversation. It is not just last year's allotments that have driven this conversation. So if the ones from last year aren't even really realized, we're really talking about what's been previous. And while I say that for council members, at our work session, I agreed with you. At our work session, I believe I favored a higher number than 6. So I'm 6 or 8, agnostic here, 6 or 8, doesn't matter. I do say that if we're talking about this in overall terms, then I would like some staff input on 2 tranches throughout the year instead of just a January 1st start, or something about that process that may improve it. But my point being is that this conversation is not just spurred on from last year's 15. This is going back years. So,
Yeah.
but again, that's where I am. I just want to put our feet on the ground with this. I want to get going. I want us to start learning from the impacts. And if there's changes to be made, then great. We can accommodate our community and again, represent our community, because that's what we do.
Yeah.
Rachel?
Well, and just a small point that we all are aware of is that because of the vesting and because of the process that can keep your vesting alive, people can hold their permits until there's a more favorable building environment or sales environment or things like that. So, that's just the system. And it's you could have 3 years worth of allotments and everyone decides to build them all in the 3rd year. It just, that's part of it. And you might have ongoing construction that hasn't ended yet from prior allotments. I kind of wanted to ask Tori, are you kind of saying that it's more important to have option 2 that sets aside some permits in some way that makes it easier for this I've owned the home for 35 years and now I'd like to redevelop group, regardless of the number, whether it's 6 or 8, that's what you would prefer to do, and that you see option 1, whether it's 6 or 8, not really accomplishing that care
Yeah.
or return to equity.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. Ward?
All right, I'm going to toss out 1A. What if we have 6 as a set number of allotments with 2, perhaps up to 2 additional allotments that would meet the criteria of option 2?
Yeah, that's what I suggested last night, but I know what you're saying. You know, that they could apply for the regular pool, or they could apply for this pool that only a few people qualify for.
And staff's response to that is option, well, the idea would be that path for the bonus 2 allotments is at the expense of the following year's allotments, right? But there would still have to be some process for securing that allotment.
No, I'm envisioning 1A as being 6 as the base number, with an additional 2 for that year, perhaps through the qualifications that were presented as in option 2, not making those 2 available to somebody.
Everybody.
Yeah. But those would have to go through special council review. People would have to have had their property and owned it and lived in it for 35 years. But that would mean that it's possible you could have 8 allotments in 1 year instead of 6. I'm just curious what the rest of council thinks about that.
I'll just respond. For me, I'm already in support of option 2 because of that resident accommodation, whether it's capped at 2 or not.
Not important.
Doesn't matter.
But in option, excuse me, John, just for a second, clarification. In this option 2, it would take 2 allotments from the next year, and 1A would be.
I understand what you're saying. You're saying an additional an additional. Okay. Yes. Yes and yes. John?
I'm listening to your comments with great interest, and I don't disagree with them, but I think we're all here because we want to try and reduce the amount of demolition. On the previous slide, it had the total number of demolitions was 59. Divide that by the 9 years that those numbers are taken from, it comes to 6.55. 6 is a little bit less than 6.55.
You know, I don't disagree with you, John, but the 2 things I see are that our housing inventory overall is just continuing to age. And so in that 10 years, we've had a lot of systems continue to get closer to real obsolescence. And then the other item is, you know, these things are always balancing acts between different goals, and different goals are more important or less important, you know, or get greater, a little greater love in some proposals than others. But the more we're keeping some of the older homes, the less energy efficient they are. And so we do know that most of our carbon emissions, whether it's in affordable housing homes or other homes, really come from the existing built environment. And so while there is now the commercial benchmarking for homes, for commercial properties, we don't have that on single-family homes in the same way. And so I guess I'm just saying, yeah, reducing demolition is part of it, but also upgrading our inventory is part of it, you know, so these are different items. I mean, it's just more of a balance for me in between goals and equity to the community.
Up on the screen, council members, is option 2A, which is what Ward was referring to.
I want an option 1A.
We'll make it 2A.
1A was already voted on?
I think because.
I'd like to put that behind
I
us.
think because great minds think alike, we perhaps anticipated this conversation a little bit. And option 2A.
You didn't just write this?
Wouldn't
Just
surprise
not.
me.
Just maybe 3 hours ago.
Prolific with the fingers.
And so this is identical to the previous option 2, which creates this additional review path for folks that can show either individual or family ownership and occupancy over 35 years. But in this case, it creates up to 2 additional allotments in a year that would only be for folks that make this qualification, and they would not be reduced from the multi-year allotment.
I can support 2A. And I have to go to the restroom.
Okay. Other comments then, Skippy?
Well, yeah, I'm just trying to kind of wrap all this together, and just first I want to say I'm really enjoying the robust discussion, right? Making the sausage at the table, so to speak. I think is actually really healthy for the community and is good. So I don't view any of this as like a I must win argument, and I fully want to get to a yes across the table that reflects best interests of the community. That said, when we're thinking about this, I have to think about John. And, 6.5 is where we've been at. None of us are saying we want more going in the landfill. None of us are saying we want more development. That's not why we're debating 1, 2, or 2A. It's not. And so even a move to 7 would be memorializing the thing that we all agree we don't want. Now, I think we all agree we do want is, Rachel said, not just for this specific group, but for the broader community to alleviate some of the feeling that they are being disadvantaged financially or otherwise by these rules. And there's sort of 2 subsections there, right? There are people who want to scrape and replace and stay and want to scrape and replace and leave. Now, this is my judgment call. You don't have to agree, but for those who want to scrape and replace and leave, I don't want to craft a rule for the whole community to incentivize that outcome that we really don't want. Shouldn't say we really don't want, which has been a negative impact to our community for decades. For the scrape and replace and stay, yeah, Rachel's right. It's an extra lottery ticket. It's not a guarantee. And so, how do we balance that? To me, I just have to come down on the side with John, and it's not apples to apples, I get that. But there is, I think, another release valve that could offer a sense of relief to the broader community about the perceived impingement from locals. And I know you didn't want to mix these up too much, but it just has to be said as far as we're having this conversation, I think the deferment agreement is a place to do that, because there are individuals like Jonathan who came before us, but frankly an increasing number, right? I mean, the workforce is now global. We have to respond to that reality, who really are full contributing members of our community, who serve on boards, who run for office, who have kids in the school, who frankly are at a financial disadvantage versus a local who qualifies under the APSHA standard. I have thought about that, right? Do we really want to create a rule that incentivizes effectively remote work in our free market, right? Is that a good thing? And, after really thinking through it, we're already there, basically. The number of jobs that qualify into the APSHA system that allow us to buy in the free market are damn near 0, and they're going to 0. So what we'd be doing is kind of expanding the definition of local, which actually right now, where there's this talk about, division between first and second and third homeowners, et cetera, might be actually a really nice way to start to weave that social fabric back together. I think that element can do a lot for alleviating that shared sense of belief, you're in the bathroom, that we're targeting or disadvantaging a particular local group, but do so without putting additional refuse in the landfill, which none of us want. It's not apples to apples, as I was saying while you're gone, but I think it does provide a different relief valve that is I think really meaningful and responds to the current situation, for what it's worth.
I'd like just to talk to John's point. I think the outlier was last year when there were 15 total, 14 single-family, 1 duplex. And that skews the numbers a little bit. But I think that your point's well taken, that the reason that we're doing something is that we've felt the pace of residential development is overwhelming the community. So whether we wind up with 6 or 8 through special review per year, I'm kind of with Tori that I'm not that married to 6 or 8, but I think that last year was a bit of an outlier and did skew the numbers. But I'm I agree with that your point that we've gotten to a point where we've felt that something has to be done, and whether it's 6 or 8 is a matter, I guess, for us to decide.
And option 2A kind of takes consideration of both those.
Yeah.
Targeting some of that local support. Okay. We have gotten the input that we asked for from staff. We have option 1, which was as the ordinance was originally drafted. We had option 2 that came to us. And then 2A, which is kind of nuanced between the several discussions that we're having here now. So again, 2A is something that I support. And can move forward with that. Again, we're going to get to a point where we're going to have a motion here, so it'll be up to the motioner about what they see fit to do. But I think we've heard input from everybody about where everybody sits on this topic. So with that, let's just back burner this until we get to the point of discussion or motions or amendments to the motion. And let's go over any other items that we need clarification on for a motion and an ordinance.
I think Skippy had a question about APSHA or second home.
For staff, yeah, their opinion about that.
I guess really the only question staff has left in terms of the content we were prepared to respond to today was this question of the deferral agreement. We can go into discussion about that if other council members are interested in that.
I'd love your opinion.
Yeah, I'd like to hear it. I mean,
Sure.
the question's been raised. I mean, I've kind of wondered, wouldn't we end up with everyone's housing mitigation being deferred for decades and not really going into production? And a lot more people being able to claim the deferral who really part year living in California, you know?
It's a concern. It's a real concern. No question.
So the current language in the section that's identified where we describe the residential mitigation deferral, I've just given the portion that responds to this particular aspect of the deferral agreement. Right now, and has been in place, I think, for decades. And again, the deferral agreement is one of the aspects of the affordable kind of housing mitigation system that still predominantly lies with APSHA. They keep track of deferral agreements. They're responsible for ending the deferral agreements. There has been talk about in this process of moving that over into ComDev, like other aspects of the affordable housing kind of mitigation system have over the last several years. But the current language does require that qualification by APSHA as a full-time local working resident. And I think as we've talked about this previously, if you also sort of qualify under APSHA's standards for folks that are either near or going into retirement, you would qualify under this standard. Yeah. Based on public comment and questions and discussion from Councilor Mesereau on Tuesday evening, there was a suggestion to change that criteria from APSHA's evaluation of your working status to simply being a requirement, as we have included in the STR for the owner-occupied permit, that we change the standard to a person's primary residence to be able to qualify for the deferral agreement. And so the alternative language that's here would reflect that change using the exact same criteria from the STR ordinance about how to identify your property as your primary residence. You know, I think it's a fairly simple code change, certainly something that we could include very easily in an updated ordinance in response to council direction. I will say that while we certainly understand the situation and the concern and the comments that were made, this idea about this deferral agreement being available to full-time local working residents has been a standard for a long time. And as we were looking at the deferral agreement, we were responding to the idea that it created uncertainty for folks that would enter into it. We were not thinking or having conversations with folks about this change. And so certainly with council direction, we can include this But I will just say throughout the process, we were focused on other aspects of the deferral agreement. And we haven't really fully understood or have investigated, as we have with most of the items that are in this ordinance, how it, might impact sort of things throughout the code or an APSHA guidelines. And so this was something that we didn't kind of study changing, but we do agree that it's a fairly simple code change that requires a very minimal change to this introductory paragraph in the deferral agreement, and it's certainly with council direction something that we could include with this ordinance.
And with respect to how the deferral agreement was originally conceived of, I mean, there's a clear and direct policy nexus between one's status as a working local and the basis of our employee generation and affordable housing mitigation system, right? So going back decades, the assumption was that if you are living and working here, you are a different part of our economy than you are if you are living and not working here, or not living and not working here, but owning property here. And so to Ben's point, not only did we not consider this from a policy standpoint in our analysis, we didn't ask the community this question when we were doing our engagement. And so that gives staff some pause about whether or not now would be the right time to pursue an amendment like this.
How does this language impact retirees and no longer full-time local working residents?
The APSHA standard.
If they qualify, he just
If
said
you've
that.
been working the last 10 years of.
So it just defers to.
To the APSHA rules that are currently in place about whether or not someone can retire into.
If you could retire in APSHA, this would count for you. If you can't, you can.
This is to you, Skippy, on this item. When we went into this, we were told really appropriately and frankly by our staff that there were just some things that weren't going to be entirely covered or changed or be part of this changes. I simply have to say I think the deferral agreement is one of those things I would not want to change now without some really significant research into what it would really mean, and how easily people could claim this or what sort of legal challenges it might be under, because I think it's fairly straightforward and clear now, but I'm not so sure it would be under this in the future. I mean, you can have a motor vehicle registered in separate states.
Yeah.
You can have different driver's licenses in different states. You can change your voter registration the day after you show what it is. And it just becomes something that, again, we're talking about the free market homes and an ability to buy into a free market home, decide you want to change it, remodel it, but there's no real contribution in the classic sense of having been a working local. And there might be evidence and research that would bring me and others around to this, but we don't have it in hand. And so I'm not going to make changes like that at this point.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally fair. It is an undercooked cake. And I was, I didn't come in looking for this or with a goal. It's just, as you articulated, we're looking for a way to relieve that perceived and or real pressure on a particular group, and this stood out as a potential opportunity. And maybe, worth revisiting at a later date, because, it is true, right? Like, for all the reasons you said, right? The individual owning that property. And this is the last thing I'll say on it because we have plenty else to do. Could be having no real community impact. It's also true there's a ton of people who absolutely do, and the rules as proposed would incentivize either the STR or the vacant home over a contributing but non-APTRA qualified full-time resident. And is that the condition that we'll want in the future?
It's also trying to say effectively that a full or part-time, but this is my primary residence, non-working local, suddenly gets elevated to the level of being as if you worked here 40 hours a week, 40 weeks a year, And, you know, and I can't do that.
Well, that's absolutely true, but only if they're competing for the same property, where what I was just saying, and I think you're in the bathroom for this, is the number of actual local jobs that can compete for that property is near zero and heading to zero, so
Yeah.
they're really competing with the investment property, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a worthy subject
Yeah.
to discuss, but I think at this time I would rather proceed without visiting that. We can come back to that later.
Okay. Can I bring up one other thing that I wanted to then, Tori?
Rachel, did you have another?
No, I was going to get a motion on the table so we could begin discussion.
I think Skippy has one.
Well, I had one other point. I had emailed this to you guys as well. But when it comes to setting the mitigation rate, we, as staff described, we have sort of these 4 buckets. And we're cranked on 3, but there's one that we've chosen to lower significantly. And that comes to the employee generation rate we're using in the calculation. There are 2 buckets to that employee generation rate. There's the construction rate, which we're doing at 100%.
Just ask the question for these guys. I mean, I really,
The question is not for them, it's discussion for us.
okay.
Yeah, and then there's the operational rate, which we've said, okay, this is what we think it actually is, but we're only going to mitigate at 25% for that.
That was the conversation at the table, correct?
Yes. And so when I looked at that, I really think that 25% bit should come up. I think that, you know, I understand why we dropped it from 100, and I can agree with that, because we're using national standards, because there's differences between different types of properties. I think that's fair. But dropping it all the way to 25 is lower than we dropped for anything else. And I think as we move forward with our housing needs, we're going to be really underserved by that choice, and it'll be hard to make up. So I'd like to see us come up from that. My dream would be, I think what's fair is 70%. I don't expect to get there. But I do want to come up. And I will also offer that in the means of kind of making the sausage, Rachel, if we can come up a bit there so we know that we're caring for affordable housing over here, that will make it easier for me to come from 6 up a little bit as well. Feels like a balance.
Okay, no, that's okay. I heard it. I heard what you said.
Yeah.
You'll come somewhere if
Right.
I come somewhere.
That's what we're doing here, right? We're trying to get
I
to
don't
an
know that
agreeable.
that's what we're doing.
Yeah, we're
You
having
know.
well, I feel as though, and I think we all do as well, that we're having a great discussion. Like this is
Yeah.
it's a great discussion.
No, we were having a great discussion. I am interested in passing code that does not immediately get reversed 9-10 months from now with a new board. And I think that the changes and the level of mitigation dollars we saw were already very, very significant. And, you know, people keep saying it's a living document. Maybe people will decide it's not enough and want to raise it in the future, but I don't want to raise that now. And if that's the negotiating chip to go to 8, I'm glad to know it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know, I'm feeling like you're like offended by my request.
No, I'm not offended by your request. It's just something that I don't know, you know, Kennedy had used the expression, the jaws of public acceptance.
Sure.
And I don't want this to be considered so punitive. And we might be very familiar with the dollars and the dollar numbers we're talking about and what's happening to rent and the prices, but I'm not so sure that that is something that's going to ring true with a large, expensive media campaign to try to reverse all this, Skippy. And so there's reasons, I think we had reasonable suggestions. I think staff has worked with a feedback loop that has been very supportive thus far, and it's not something I'm willing to change here at the table.
Point of clarification, we're talking about mitigation, so we're talking about a future tax, which we've authorized polling on, but we'll.
No.
That's for short-term rentals. This
Unrelated.
is not mitigation for,
Mitigation rates in residential redevelopment for single-family or duplex homes.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Happens to all of us.
It's a big, complicated soup.
Like going
Is
on.
that an onion? Is that a shallot? What is that?
This last week has definitely run together for all. All right, let's clear. We've got a suggestion on the table. We've got a response from Rachel. I, as well, as I've said 100 times, I'll say it again, I want to get our feet on the ground. I think that what we've got in front of us is some great work. So at this time, I'm not going to be supporting that.
Okay. In terms of making a motion so we can have discussion, 13 and 14 have to be separate, but we do them at the same time.
No, we're doing one at a time.
Separate motions, I would recommend you do them one at a time.
Okay, then if you'd accept a motion.
I was going to make one before, let me stop for your last question.
Yep. I'm going to go to Rachel for a motion.
Yeah, I would make a motion to approve ordinance number 13 with the language change to include the section 2A as we've seen it here on the board, and make any other language changes throughout the document to create alignment as needed with the 2A language.
I second that.
Does that cover all the bases that need to be?
I believe it does.
From staff's perspective, yes. Jim, you good?
I'm good.
Okay.
All right, thank you. We have a motion and a second. Further discussion.
For me.
Yeah, I appreciate the goal of, well, I share the goal of wanting to have a unified approval of something. I do feel that 2A will create an outcome that we all know we say we don't want, which is additional things in the landfill, additional impacts on the environment. While I would have preferred 1, I want to be here with this council after all of this work. And so I would ask, can we compromise and go at least from 8 to 7, so 1 additional rather than 2?
He's asking for an amendment to the motion. The motioner.
We can discuss them.
That's what I'm asking in discussion.
I would not accept it as a friendly amendment. We can discuss it among the board and then make it an amendment
Thank
approach
you.
and see if there's a second.
John.
Thanks for kicking that off, Skippy, because I sit here slightly disappointed. I thought we did this so that we could reduce the amount of demolition in our community. That's what we tasked staff with doing. That's, I think, why my voters put me in this office. Again, the number 15 from 2019 or 2020, that was an outlying number, and I think we can all agree that was due to the urban exodus and COVID. The other number that was an outlier was 9. Most of the other numbers were 3, 4, 5. At any rate, I will go along with Skippy's suggestion of raising it to 7 in the interest of compromise.
In the interest of compromise, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for your comments.
I think just as hypothetical, if we pass with a proposed amendment of 7, which means that 1 additional allocation would be possible to the group of people identified in option 2, so 35-year resident, we would still be able to get to 8, but 1 of those would come out of a future year allotment. So I think with Skippy's suggestion and John's support, we're going from 6 to 7 through special review for that group of longtime residents. With anything above that would be coming from future year allotments.
Yeah, I do want to make sure we're clear and hearing everything. Is the suggestion that the change in 2A to go from 2 to 1?
Yeah.
That
that's
gets
right.
from 6 to 7, so that's what you're really
That's what
suggesting.
we're suggesting as a compromise position.
Okay. So does that clarify where you are?
Yeah, that's what I was,
Yeah.
I think that's what both Skippy and John were getting at.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, so I suppose you need to formally make that a motion to amend the motion.
Sure.
John can second it, then we'll have a vote on it and see where it goes.
Okay, is that something that, I mean, you,
I'm not supportive of it. I think, I'm not. I'm sorry, I've already explained a couple of my reasons why. I think you're almost immediately going to have special review type meetings. And the people who are going to get caught the most in it are the locals, the longer term locals. And, I don't see the difference between the numbers in the way that others do as a principled point. I think having something that makes more sense to our community and perhaps doesn't create further divisions over who got what and, the very first special hearing. I mean, the way this code is set up, you could do multiple year allotments out for 5 years. There's nothing that says you can't do multiple year allotments for 8 years. And we're just setting it up so people ask for multiple year allotments because we're not putting enough allotments in the first place.
Rachel, excuse me, a point of order. On an amendment that has been placed, does it have to be accepted as a friendly amendment?
By the maker of the motion.
No, he can move to amend, as Rachel said earlier. Skippy can move to amend. If John wishes to second, he seconds. Then you debate that and decide whether you want to accept it.
So what's the difference between that and a friendly
A
amendment?
friendly amendment doesn't require the motions and everything, and
Okay.
and the maker of the motion and the seconder can approve a friendly amendment.
Okay.
But I don't remember who seconded this.
I was the second of the,
Okay.
yeah.
But the maker of the motion would have to agree, then the seconder would have to agree if it's a friendly amendment,
And if it's not a friendly amendment, then it just goes through
a motion process.
a motion, okay.
Rachel, can I ask a few questions of you to truly, not to try to win this argument, but to understand where you're coming from? Because you have a lot more experience than I do. You've been through a lot more election cycles than I do, or I have, I guess. And I certainly don't want to see this really hard-fought work overturned either. What is it that you see? I guess in my mind, whether we go to 6 to 8, how much does that diffuse? And 7 versus 8, I mean, why is that this will work and this will not in your mind?
Well, I'll tell you a couple things. One is that I've really been listening to the public, and I've been thinking about our prior work sessions and how we went about selecting the numbers. And the other is simply, I don't believe that last year was necessarily as much of a one-off. I think that the nature of the community is changing between aging residents and between aging infrastructure such as homes. And I think that the trend line is going to be more replacement of homes, period. And I think that you get to a point where you really are starting to create real divisions in your community by having it so tight that it ends up being all erased in the future. And there's, people talk about unintended consequences, and one of the unintended consequences is that this could all go away. And I think that sometimes you can ask for too much. And I think that this is reasonable. And again, I don't think that there will be ebbs and flows in the market for any number of reasons related to interest rates and availability of construction workers. But I don't think that the number is going, I don't think this is the normal. This is normal now. I don't think we're going to go back to some peaceful, idyllic time in the early 90s when you only had 3 demolition permits a year. That's where, you asked, that's what I think.
No, I agree. And I agree with that characterization that this is a new normal. And to me, that's an even greater impetus to have a lower number. But I appreciate that. And I do agree and understand your reasoning. So I guess I would move to amend the motion to adopt this with option 2A, but limiting that additional number from 2 to 1 if the board was interested.
I'll second that.
Just to clarify, the motion is to amend, I believe, the second sentence there in Where it says up to 2 allotments, it should
would say
say one
one
additional
additional
allotment
annual
may be
allotment.
granted. That's the amendment.
That's the amendment.
That's the specifics of the amendment.
Yes.
Everybody agree?
That's right.
So there's a motion.
And-
The motion was that.
Okay.
That's okay with the seconder.
And just so I'm really clear, you're leaving the original 6 as available for anyone and new buyers, everything like that, and only 1 for the potential over 35.
That's how I've amended it, but if you have a sort of additional
Oh,
iteration.
I know
then
that's how you did it. I was thinking why not make it 2
2, 4.
and 5 or whatever.
understand that.
But,
Just a quick point of clarification on that. Your 35-plus year local can apply for one of the 6.
right.
And then that additional, that off-ramp, that other path is
Only
only
for
available
those.
to them.
Right.
Well, and in the way we've written it, they must apply for,
Must apply for that. So
That's
any
6.
one single local
who had applied.
competing against all the other 35-year home locals for the one
Yeah.
that they can apply for.
But Rachel, if that is a sticking point for you, and if it was 5 and 2, if that would help, then I'm open to
No,
that.
I'm not on board at all with the proposal, but let's, you can discuss the merits further. and
We have a motion and a second for an amendment to the motion, and I want some further discussion. I'm going to start that further discussion. We are making great progress here. I came back to this special meeting on Thursday for consideration of some additional allowances for those members of our community that have been here for a long time. That's what I'm doing. You've made 2 suggestions tonight. One is to reduce an allotment for these locals, and the other was about housing requirements or residency requirements for people that may or may not be full residents. I would really say that we are making great steps forward, and bringing this request for an amendment to the motion, I cannot support. And
Yeah, I hear that.
more to say later.
I hear that.
Comments, further discussion?
Yeah, I think that I agree with everything as the conversation going on here. We're talking about one allotment and or one additional allotment for a group of locals that have been in town for 35 years. That's not an automatic. It still has to go through a review process. So although I honor Skippy and certainly John on their amendment, I would like to stick with the original and not support the amendment.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second for an amendment to the motion. Can we please have a roll call vote for that motion?
Wait, can I, point of clarification?
Sure.
If or when this fails, we still can go back, we'll still go back and vote on the other, correct? It's just the vote on the amendment. Great.
This is just the amendment.
Councillor Doyle,
Yes.
Councillor Howenstein,
No.
Councillor Mesro,
Yes.
Councillor Richards,
No.
Mayor Tory.
No.
Okay, the amendment fails, and we still have a motion on the table to adopt option 2A.
Well, your motion is to adopt ordinance 13.
Yeah, with
With
the
or-
language change, sorry about that.
That's okay.
So we have a motion and a second for approval of ordinance 13 with the language of option 2A. In front of us, I'll take further discussion.
My only further comment and closing comment is that, again, this is something we can revisit. We can revisit at any time. So we can see what the action is on these special reviews and make necessary adjustments going forward.
I would only comment that we have all made compromises along the way. We all come to the table with different perspectives and different issues that are top of mind for us. I hope we can see this pass with a 5-0 vote, but if not, if people need to step back from this, I'd understand, but we would have that potential of a totally failed vote and no new code at all. So I think we should all bear that in mind.
Further comment? Further discussion?
So just sort of, I guess, general closing comments. Democracy's messy. That's a feature, not a bug.
It's true.
Thanks.
We're supposed to have differing opinions because we come from different experiences. And we're supposed to recognize that in a trusted debate amongst peers who share a vision for a better community, that we land on a outcome that is higher and better and more evolved than any one individual mind can create. And you have to have trust in the wisdom of the team, even when it gives you heartburn, which I have a bit right now. And so I do. And when we began this journey, I thought back to where our community's been over the last many decades. And we have, in our residential sector, been on a negative trajectory, a trajectory of the conversion of lived-in community to a place that not just physically looks and feels different, but is used differently. Not from a lived-in home, but to a empty, vacant investment property or a commercial like STR lodge. And I wish 40 years ago we had started doing this work then, so there would have been less of that conversion. But I recognize we respond to the adjacent possible. And the people who were responding then did a lot to preserve our community in a way that others didn't. And so we're very lucky to be at the less than optimum situation we arrive at now. These rules are not perfect. They're not going to transform our community overnight, but they are going to do a significant amount immediately and create the conditions for a much larger shift, for a return back towards the condition of full lived-in community over time. This is really walking into the empty field with no food production and there's a bunch of rocks, removing those rocks, tilling the soil and putting down those seeds. Some things will grow, but with appropriate water, sunlight, and nourishment, a real garden can, and I believe, will blossom. The next steps after this are going to be working with our development community to ask the question of how to rebalance the incentive structure with our new process so that our development community can make good money, live here, producing the products we most need, which are 100% affordable products, rather than those which we less need. And although it's not perfect, this makes meaningful change for our environment, for our community, for our affordable housing. I'm proud to have been part of this with each of you, truly. I mean, it's been quite a journey. So I will, on balance, support this.
Thank you. I will not be speech-making, but I will have a couple comments. We say we want to be a sustainable, livable, and enjoyable Aspen community. This is a step in that direction. I support the demolition regulations that we are looking at for environmental and community impact reasons. I support the appropriate affordable housing mitigation on residential development. I support a streamlined or improved affordable housing approval process, and I support the additional inclusive affordable housing opportunities. In my election by the voters of Aspen, I was elected for environmental, affordable housing, and support for local business and residentials, and a slowdown of the deterioration of Aspen through the development of commercial and residential properties. Today, we take a step in that direction. I will be supporting this today.
Call the question?
I'd like to, but Rachel?
Sorry. You know, I was just going to say, there's a fellow who used to be very active in town, Jim Kent, and he had coined the term termination community, that we were a termination community because everybody talked about how much they'd be worth when they left and when they sold, and that was the definition of it. And that's catchy, but at the end of the day, we're not a termination community. It's just an evolving community, and it's new people and new attitudes and new approaches. And, you know, if you want to keep some of the Aspen of yore, you have to be able to bring them along and tell them the story of why various compromises were made and things like that. But at the end of the day, if you really look back, there's been, at least in my time, 30 years worth of really hard choices that have helped curate and shape this community to be the single highest value, scrape and replace property values in the country. You know, there's a reason it's so desirable. And these code changes, which I've seen over the years, have always been decried as the last death blow. But it really has not been the case. And value, tremendous value, has been created for everyone who owns free market property by limiting growth, by limiting the competition of growth, by limiting so many aspects of our community. And that is what this is doing further. And I see it as restoring community and continuing to protect that value that so many from across the globe seem to want to buy into. Thank you.
Could we have a roll call vote, please, for the motion as made?
Counselor Doyle,
Yes.
Counselor Howenstein,
Yes.
Counselor Mesro,
Yes.
Counselor Richards,
Yes.
Mayor Tory.
Yes. We need to get to ordinance number 14 now.
Yes.
Does staff need any other presentation or information this afternoon?
Staff does not have any remarks prepared for ordinance 14, but they're happy to support any discussion council may have about the contents of the ordinance.
Thank you. I would take a motion if council members are ready.
I move we adopt ordinance 14, series 2022.
Second, and clarification. We had the public hearing for this ordinance on Tuesday
Yes.
night as well, before it was closed. Okay,
Yes.
thank you. I just wanted that on the record.
We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Being none, could we have a roll call vote for ordinance 14, please?
Counselor Doyle,
Yes.
Counselor Howenstein,
Yes.
Counselor Mesro,
Yes.
Counselor Richards,
Yes,
Mayor Tory.
Yes. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you guys for all of your work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor and Council.
7 months.
I would take a motion for adjournment today.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Second,
We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, can
Thank
we
you,
have a
Dennis.
roll call vote, please?
Counselor Doyle,
Yes.
Counselor Howenstein,
Yes.
Counselor Mesro,
Yes.
Counselor Richards,
yes.
Mayor Tory.
Yes. Thanks. Do you have a couple minutes?
I do, but I have a call at 6 minutes, so